Today, as we move closer to taking the advanced placement exam, we're going to review the women's movement. And certainly these are episodes and issues that we've talked about as we go through the course. But as we are doing in all of these review units, we're trying to take certain aspects of American history, take them from their beginnings, and bring them down to as close to the present day as is practical, given the fact that we've got to get a lesson in about an hour. So as we look at the women's movement today, we're going to primarily look at organizations, those organizations that sought to promote their view of what would advance the movement to gain political and economic rights for women. Now, since the 1840s, a variety of organizations have approached the issue of political rights for women, and we're going to be looking at a number of those organizations today. But we're going to start with the situation before 1840, and I simply chose 1840 as a somewhat arbitrary point in history to look at. And you'll notice, and I chose the words very carefully here, that the legal and economic status of women was uncertain. Now, when I say uncertain, I am meaning that it was highly ambiguous, that it was never a situation where there was anything very cut and dried about it. Because we do find that through history, there are a number of women who have held economic power, even some who have held political power, coming out of specific circumstances. But certainly, as a rule, the average woman had rather little in terms of either legal power, political power, or economic power. So let's look at the situation before 1840, always remembering that there are going to be exceptions. First, legally, women were held to be the property of their fathers or their husbands. And when we say property, we mean that term pretty specifically. Now, certainly this is not property in the same way that African Americans were property, at least those who were enslaved were property. But there is a real sense in which the woman was treated in law as the property of her father or her husband. Now, they couldn't be sold except in marriage, and the marriage laws were very, again, somewhat ambiguous and varied from state to state slightly, but there was a sense in which a marriage was not just a coming together of two people who loved each other, but marriage was also an economic situation, where the property of the woman, whatever that property might be, would be transferred from her father to her husband. The property itself was often in the name of the woman, but the control of the property, which is, after all, kind of the more important thing. I mean, I don't care if I own it as long as I get to control it, would be in the hands of that woman's father if she was unmarried or if she was married to her husband. Now, generally speaking, there's a huge exception to that. And that exception was the case of married women whose husbands had passed away. And in that situation, women often had a vastly greater degree of economic freedom. Once their husbands had passed away, they often had a level of control over their property that they would not have had in any other circumstance. And generally speaking, the percentage of a husband's property that the woman would actually own was usually a third. And so in most states, if there were children, the estate would be divided up 1/3, 2/3. 2/3 going to the children, 1/3 going to the woman. And now, of course, oftentimes, if the children were minors, that woman would be controlling the property for her children. If it was a large estate, there might have been a trustee set up, a lawyer, a banker, or someone of that sort. But generally speaking, if it's if the estate was relatively small, the woman would have 1/3 of it, the children would have the remaining 2/3. And that 1/3 was generally considered to be 1/3 use for life. So that at the appropriate time when the woman herself passed away, then that property would come down to her children, at least her male children, in what was called fee simple, which meant the ability to own it, to sell it, to use that property in any way that the person saw fit. Economically, women usually had the status of their husbands or their fathers. And status was an important point. Status was a factor for many, many people in terms of what station in society they held. So if they were born into a working class family, they would often be working class individuals. If they were born into a farming family, they would take on that status. When they married, they took on the status of their husband. And certainly there are lots of cases where, probably these are more true in terms of fiction than they were in terms of reality, but it certainly did happen from time to time, where a woman who was relatively poor might attract the attention of a potential husband who was considerably better off, and they would marry. And at that point, the woman would leave behind the social status of her father and take on the social status of her husband. Now, in the stories, that usually meant going up. In reality, it could also mean a move down, and so oftentimes women who came from families that were relatively wealthy might avoid marriage to a husband who was of a lower social status, because then the woman would assume that social status as well. Not to say that it didn't happen, but it was rare. The first organization, and it's a very loose organization, that comes to look at the rights of women is sometimes called the Seneca Falls Movement. Seneca Falls Movement is around from 1848 to roughly 1865, and you'll notice that word, that abbreviation CA there, it's an abbreviation for the term circa, which was a Latin term meaning right around 1865. Basically what happens with the Seneca Falls Movement is that once the Civil War comes along, the movement itself loses a certain amount of importance as those issues of nationality, as those issues of abolition come to the fore. The movement toward women's rights takes something of a back seat. Now, that's not necessarily willingly, but that was the case. It did become less important, or at least less in the public eye. The leaders of the Seneca Falls Movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Their goals were to overcome the ideas of the cult of true womanhood. Now, you may remember from the very early period of the class that cult of true womanhood. The prevailing ideology, and this comes along in roughly 1800 more or less, that the true woman found her reason for existence in terms of raising her children, operating a household, providing a refuge in which her husband could get away from the cares and concerns of the larger world. There was thought to be something unwomanly about wanting to attain economic power on her own. That was, again, something that rose in 1800. There's sort of a perception, and it's a mistaken perception, I believe, that that had been the case since the beginning of time. And that's not quite true. What we begin to see starting about 1800 is the possibility of dividing labor. The cult of true womanhood was something you generally did not see among farmers, for instance, because the farmer's wife often threw in her labors to do the hard labor of farming, especially at certain times of the year when that was necessary. At harvesting time, it was all hands turn out, because that harvesting needed to get done in a very short period of time before the crops rotted, and they needed to be brought in, and they needed to be stored properly, and so on and so on and so on. So where oftentimes a farm wife might have found most of her work being done inside of the home, there were frequent times during the year, and they were largely predictable, that when the woman would go out and do some of the actual labor of farming rather than the labor of maintaining a home for the farmer. And certainly, and this happened frequently, if the farmer died and there were only minor children involved, the woman would often take on the labor that her husband did. If they were fairly prosperous, she might actually hire out the difficult physical labor that she might have difficulty doing, but she became the farmer, she became the decision maker, and so on. But the cult of true womanhood, as industrialization begins to happen, as the home and the workplace become two different places, this cult of true womanhood arises, that it was, again, somehow unwomanly to want to participate in the economic life that her husband participated in. And so the Seneca Falls Movement sees this, again, relatively recent development. Again, this is 1848. This cult of true womanhood has its roots in about 1800. So it's relatively a new thing. There were certainly people alive who could remember when that was not the prevailing ideology. And in fact, there were families in which it never became the prevailing ideology. Of course, beyond that, women in the Seneca Falls Movement want the right to vote. And that's going to be the keystone of all of these women's movements up until 1920, when the 19th Amendment gave to women the right to vote. They want to improve the legal status of women. In many places, it was impossible for a woman to bring suit against someone who had economically wronged them. They would need to find some male representative, again, usually a father or a husband, but in a situation where there might not be a father or a husband, they might appoint or might need to appoint a lawyer or some other male family friend to pursue their legal interests. And that was certainly true of the economic status of women as well, although women had always had a greater economic status than they had as a legal status. The simple fact was that women often participated in the economic decisions of their husbands, especially if the husband was a farmer or if the husband was an artisan who worked out of a room in their home, which was quite a common thing in cities, going really back into medieval times. So if the husband was a bootmaker, then the bootmaker's shop would be the lower floor front of the house, and the family would live in the back of the first floor and up and whatever floors there were above that. And so it was quite common for people to come and go from work to home on a very, very regular basis. And under those circumstances, women did often have a fair amount of economic power. They would know what was going on within this business. They would often have to participate in it. They're often substituting for their husband if their husband needed to leave for some period of time. The woman might go into the shop or into the place of business to rather substitute for her husband, so that if someone came by, they would have someone with whom they could speak, whatever. But we do often see that the economic status of women was considerably higher than the legal status. Now, who are their supporters? Interestingly enough, when the Seneca Falls Resolution was signed, almost a third of the signers were men. But they were all, whether it was a male or a woman, these were all middle-class people. This was a movement that came out of people who were not the downtrodden. This came out of people who had attained some level of achievement, again, often because of the developments of the industrial society. And there were those women who had participated in that. What are their methods? Well, the famous one is the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. It was based upon the Declaration of Independence, with certain additions, the famous one being substituting the language from the Declaration of Independence that said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that kind of linguistic change. But for the most part, that document was founded upon the Declaration of Independence. The Seneca Falls Movement did not just sign this document and go home at during 1848. They would hold annual meetings until about the beginning of the Civil War. As I said, this movement never really officially disbands. It just kind of fizzles out, if you will. And they were very active in soliciting the support of sympathetic men. And there were many. As I said, a third of the signers of that original document were men. There were men around who did support the idea that women were intellectually capable, if not perhaps totally equal. I mean, there was some room for some sort of fudging there. There were those men who believed that women were the intellectual equals of men, but at least that women did have intellectual capacity. That was fairly obvious to anyone who looked around. And so there were always this group of sympathetic men who were important parts of this movement. And of course, since all political power was in the hands of men, any chance that they would have of achieving some political power would have to be done through the auspices of sympathetic men. The Civil War came, the Civil War went, the Seneca Falls Movement, as I said, rather fizzled out. And the next movement is something called the American Women's Suffrage Association. It started in 1869. Its leaders are Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. If you're familiar with one of those two names, it's probably Julia Ward Howe. She is most famous as the author of a piece of music called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which you have probably heard, perhaps even sung at some point. What do they want? They want an amendment to the Constitution that will permit women's suffrage, that will permit women to gain the right to vote. So then, at that point, who are their supporters? This is a relatively conservative bunch. So they're relatively well off. They are not radicals. They're not revolutionaries. Really, all they want is the right of women to vote. They're strongest in the area around Boston, Massachusetts, and they indeed traded on much of the Revolutionary War era language and heritage of that era in terms of gaining support for their movement. They also found a significant amount of support among abolitionist men, those men who had recently participated in the process of freeing African Americans, and that movement had been especially strong around the Boston area. For instance, that is the area where William Lloyd Garrison lived, and so on. So, and Garrison himself did become a supporter of this movement, along with many of his other supporters. What are their methods? They're going to work on a state-by-state basis. Our Constitution basically gives to states the power to decide who votes and who doesn't. They believed that the easiest way to gain this power was to go at it on a state-by-state basis, and then hopefully as individual states gave to women these rights, than to use that as an example to other states. Didn't work terribly well, but this was their strategy. They tended to avoid reforms that weren't directly related to the right to vote. So they're not particularly interested, at least not as an organization, in other legal rights, in economic rights. Their scope is very limited and is purely limited to the right to vote. Now, eventually this organization lost much of its spark as this first generation of people died out, and they would eventually merge with the next organization that we're going to look at, the National Women's Suffrage Association. And I apologize for any confusion this may cause. This organization was the American Women's Suffrage Association. They merged with the National Women's Suffrage Association. The new organization would come to be called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So there's not a lot of originality, but I think for purposes of the AP exam, don't get too focused upon these differences, because the goals are similar enough that you'll be able to get through with it. If it turned out to be an essay question and you knew the difference and you were able to explain that, that would probably be a point in your favor. But I think it highly unlikely that those differences are going to be seen as particularly important. So let's then move on to the National Women's Suffrage Association. And as you can see, its dates are 1869, same time, same year as the American Women's Suffrage Association. But this organization is going to last considerably longer. It's going to go down to roughly 1920, and you'll notice I put a question mark there. I also could have put that little CA period in front of 1920. It never really officially goes out of business. They just sort of stop meeting. And of course, those of you who already know the story know that in 1920 you see women actually attaining the right to vote, and so many who were participants in this organization saw basically their job was done. It was time to do other things. Leaders of the organization are Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and you may recognize that name. She was one of the leaders of the Seneca Falls Movement. By the 1870s, 1880s, she's sort of the grandmother figure of the women's suffrage movement, and she lived to be quite an old lady. I can't remember exactly when she passed away, but she did live to be long enough to be, in a sense, sort of the matriarch of the whole movement. The new face is a colleague of Stanton's, very, very close friends, Susan B. Anthony. Somewhat younger woman, but very, very closely allied with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Their goals change over time. When they first started, it was hoped that the language of the 15th Amendment would be interpreted broadly enough to provide for women the right to vote. And if you want the specific language of the 15th Amendment, let me suggest that you look it up. But basically, the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. And the women hoped that that phrase, previous condition of servitude, would be interpreted to include them as well. The Supreme Court would disappoint them, and that their interpretation did not prevail. And so after a period of time, they came to support the idea of a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution, although they certainly were willing to take it on a state-by-state basis as well. They're very pragmatic. It's kind of whatever works. They do, however, also advocate a wider range of reforms than the American Women's Suffrage Association, particularly, as I said earlier, those legal and economic situations that were very much a part of the lives of women at the time. Their supporters tend to be younger than the supporters of the American Women's Suffrage Association. They are particularly strong in upstate New York and in the West. They were different from the previous organizations in which they limited their, at least the officials in the organization had to be all women. It was possible for a man to join the National Women's Suffrage Association, but he could not hold office. They, again, at first lobbied Congress extensively to be included in the language of the 15th Amendment, and as I said later, they demand a separate women's suffrage amendment. But these are, even though they start off as relatively younger, they're still a reasonably conservative organization, somewhat more inclusive perhaps than the American Civil Rights, or excuse me, the American Women's Suffrage Association, but nonetheless a different organization altogether. The next organization was much more radical. As a new generation of people come along, a new generation of leaders for this movement come along, they come to decry the innate conservatism of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And these are much more political folks, and they come to call themselves the National Women's Party. Their leaders are Alice Paul, and some of you may have seen the film Iron-Jawed Angels, which is a treatment of the life of Alice Paul. There's some fictionalization in there, but some very unforgettable scenes. And if you have not seen the movie, let me strongly suggest that you take a look at it before you take the AP exam if you've got the time. It's pretty well done. I think it's a better movie toward the end than it is at the beginning. The beginning is a little confused, but the storyline kind of evens out as you get closer to the end of the film. And it shows very graphically what the National Women's Party did. The money came from a woman named Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, incredibly wealthy woman. First, she married one of the Vanderbilt family, a grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the New York Central Railroad. When they divorced, she took a great deal of money with her out of that union. She later married a man named Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, who was rich in his own right, although not quite Vanderbilt rich, but she had a great deal of money. And she really is the person who's able to fund this movement. Their goals are, at first, votes for women. As that becomes a goal that is achieved, they then turn toward the idea of the Equal Rights Amendment. And we will talk much more about the Equal Rights Amendment as we go on through the PowerPoint. Their supporters are young, educated women, most of them college educated. The numbers of college educated women was very much on the increase. One of the reform movements of the 1840s had been the creation of colleges specifically intended for women, sometimes referred to as the Seven Sisters, that is sort of the, if you will, the female Ivy League. Those schools, Bryn Mawr, Sarah Lawrence, Radcliffe, and so on, are getting established in the 1840s, 1850s, and they are now producing enough graduates to provide a basis, a group of people who would then come to support the National Women's Party. So they're much more militant. They're doing public protests, and you can see the illustration on the screen, which is a public protest that happened in front of the White House. Very, very famous. Largely because of the reaction of Woodrow Wilson to that protest. And eventually he calls out the police. They arrested many of these women. They were sent to jail. Their militants came out there. There was a series of hunger strikes within the jail. There were some hunger strikes that happened out on the street in support of the women who were in jail. There was a degree of civil disobedience. That, again, largely ends with 1920, when women do get the right to vote. The National Women's Party did continue to advocate for women's issues, but as it turned out, it had to seem for a time in the 1930s, 1940s that their time had passed. The Great Depression, the Second World War, the coming of greater prosperity as we get into the 1950s seemed to push women's issues to the back. And I suspect that if you had asked most people about women's rights in the middle of the 1950s, they would have said, well, that job's been done. Women have the right to vote, and therefore this legal right had been secured. There were a precious few women who had gotten elected to various state houses, state House of Representatives, state senates, even a couple that had been elected to the U.S. Congress. Very, very, very few in number. Women by this time are able to own property in their own names and so on. Women are able to bring suits in courts of law. And so there was a perception in much of the 1930s, 40s, 50s that the passage of the 19th Amendment had largely won the struggle for rights for women. Now that's going to be differed with later, and certainly those members of the National Women's Party who remained active would have differed with that. But for the most part, after the 19th Amendment, they get kind of shunted off to the side as other events become perceived to be more important. So that then brings us to the modern women's movement. In 1966, we see the foundation of something called the National Organization for Women. These people who are arguing that many rights for women had not been won by the passage of the 19th Amendment, that there is still considerable work that needs to be done, and specifically what they want, and they pick up from the National Women's Party, this concept of enshrining equal rights for women into the Constitution itself through what they called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. These are also women who are arguing that women should have the ability to terminate their pregnancies. In more recent years, they have expanded their scope still further, and if you look at the National Organization for Women's website, you will find support for a wide variety of other issues in which they vest their support. They are founded by Betty Friedan and Pauli Murray. They obviously have had a couple of generations of leaders in the years since. Their supporters tend to be liberal, college-educated women, of whom there are large numbers in modern American life. Their methods are to lobby Congress, lobby state legislatures. They did in the 1960s and 1970s a great number of public protests that tended to echo, if you will, the activities of the civil rights movement, the activities of the anti-war movement. And in a sense, the women's movement seems to be saying, and then I hope I'm not going to sound paternalistic as I say this, but there did appear to be this sense that women were saying, wait a minute, we have rights too, our issues need to be dealt with, and they're trying to move those issues onto the front burner at the same time that these civil rights and anti-war issues are being dealt with. And so there are lots of public protests for many, many years, and then they still happen today. You're most likely to find them today on the steps of the Supreme Court when an issue that is important to the modern National Organization for Women comes up. You will find these public protests. They also mount a series of legal challenges to laws that they saw as discriminatory. So it really is very much, again, very much the same impulses as the National Women's Party. And in fact, when the National Women's Party did finally dissolve in, I believe it was 1997, you can look back a couple of slides if you wish to see the exact date, they're really pretty much absorbed into the National Organization for Women. And they've enjoyed a considerable degree of success. If you want some proof of that, just look around the school and you will see a wide variety of activities for women, especially athletic activities that would not have been seen even 30 years ago. The idea that women's sports are to be financed at the same level as men's sports and so on. That was a concept that grew out of the National Organization for Women. The idea that those of you who are trying to get scholarships, especially athletic scholarships, virtually no athletic scholarships for women to go to college, even as late as the 1980s. Those scholarships exist today. And that may seem somewhat peripheral, but it's just a situation that might apply to many of you that shows the importance of this organization and of this relative success of its goals. Now, of course, the big goal that they were not able to get was the Equal Rights Amendment, this ERA. They came very close. The ERA was approved by Congress in 1972. It was sent to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states were required. Since we have 50 states, that meant that 38 states needed to ratify that amendment. And when the 38th state ratified it, it would become part of the Constitution. The fact that that did not happen is largely due to the next organization we're going to look at, and many, many, many women's historians would object to the inclusion of this organization. I think it's important because it's part of the story. There are those, however, who see this as sort of an anti-women's organization. But nonetheless, we do need to spend a little bit of time looking at an organization called Eagle Forum. They're formed in 1972, at the time that Congress sent the Equal Rights Amendment to the states. The founder of this organization is a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who you can see at the time in an anti-ERA rally, if you will. And their goal, at least at first, is to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. Mrs. Schlafly and her supporters pointed out that the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment would mean that women were subject to the draft. It also meant that some of the preferences that were given to women in terms of family law, especially in terms of divorce law, spousal support, child care, custody of children, those laws tended to favor women. And her point was that if you will, favoritism would go away if the Equal Rights Amendment were passed. And that argument carried the day. The Equal Rights Amendment was eventually ratified by 35 states, not 38, and basically the 36th, 37th, and 38th states never ratified it, and it sort of dissolved when it reached the time limit that was given to it in 1982, again largely through the efforts of Mrs. Schlafly and the Eagle Forum. Its supporters tended to be conservative women, And they use many of the same processes that the other women's movements did. They lobby Congress. You can see a photograph now on the screen of Mrs. Schlafly meeting with Ronald Reagan, who broadly supported that movement. They became very close allies. They do a lot of radio. There are a lot of publications. You will also often find them rallying on the steps of the Supreme Court at the same time that you find the NOW people. You will also find Eagle Forum and other related organizations there providing a sort of counter voice. And of course, occasionally when those issues come up, the media like to look at those because there's always the possibility that there will be some sort of at least verbal altercation between these two groups of people. So at any rate, that's where we leave it today. The women's movement, again, a movement that started very early in the history of the country, back in the 1840s, part of that wave of reform that was so much a part of the 1840s, and in a very real way echoes other reform movements as we come through the history of the United States. We have this movement in the 1840s, part of that wave of reform. We start seeing this second wave of reform that comes along. We sometimes call it the progressive era, that comes along in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, so basically from 1900 to 1920, and of course at the end of that time women get the right to vote. And then with this other reform era that is the 1960s. And there's a women's component in each of these major periods of reform in American life. What the future will behold, we can really only speculate. But nonetheless, that is the history up to now, and that is where we will leave it. And I do hope that you have found this useful. Again, I hope that you went a little beyond the information that was actually printed on the PowerPoint when you were taking your notes, so that they will be more complete and you will be able to use them more successfully in your preparations for the advanced placement exam.